Hi Brendan.
Hi Joe.
Okay, so I'm here with Brendan Benson. He's a very experienced teacher of the IB Literature course and NYP Literature here at Canadian International School. Lucky enough to be a colleague of him and really enjoy the conversations we have about learning. In particular, his use of digital learning environments and his own ethos, which we might say is broadly at the formalist end of the spectrum, where mine is at the slightly more critical theory-based end of the spectrum, and we find this makes for a really interesting discourse.
That's fair to say.
Yeah.
You got to start with building blocks.
Yeah.
That's what I believe, fundamentally. And that also includes why we look at something Plath, the Colossus, which critics would argue is a building block in poetry.
Yep. That makes sense. That really makes sense to me, and I think it's nice that it's the unit that the higher level students really begin the part to learning towards the IOC assessment on the course. Tell me about the significance of form and why Plath unit is particularly strong for this.
Well, I think handing them a book where critics have said, essentially, this is Plath's juvenilia, and she's written better stuff, gives students the opportunity to maybe feel comfortable by that. You know, she hasn't become a full-fledged poet. She's somebody they can access, and I think thematically, in terms of the age in which she wrote, in the confessional genre, the students can really relate to the content.
And how do you really, right from the beginning of the course, in a really exciting way, get them straight into the significance of form and give them their grounding in poetic devices?
We run this task beginning day 2. After we read through the book, we have a day where we just read. We don't even open the laptops. I do attendance and that's it. But the task is called the periodic table of poetry. And essentially it's the science of poetry, the form of poetry, where students get to show me what their knowledge is regarding formal elements of language, which relates directly to criterion C on the HL rubric of the oral commentary. Because what we are concerned about is how form shapes meaning. How does a writer's craft have an impact on me as a reader?
Could we have a look at this?
Precisely. The periodic table of poetry is rather simple, and I took the idea from an online page called Design Through Storytelling, called the Periodic Table of Storytelling. So the students have an exemplar to work from, where it breaks down the elements, the groups by structure, setting, story modifiers, plot.
So they got that kind of structuralist, formalist application to genre and plot in storytelling, and then they extrapolate that to the use of poetic devices in poetry.
Precisely, and that's all I leave them with, is this term poetic devices. And how do we group poetic devices conceptually? And so the class has to divide and conquer, discuss and agree upon the organization for our table, ideally for a visual bulletin board that the students can make reference to, or take a photo of and have printed in their notebooks. So it's up to them to figure out what this form of poetry looks like, and then also weight it based on its appearance in Sylvia Plath's poetry in particular. And I like this idea of the periodic table as a table in flux over the course of a unit, because the students familiarize themselves with her style. Unlike other poets, they might notice that Plath tends to use sound imagery a lot more, or she uses another form of rhetoric over another, just giving students some insight then on their own bias, I think, is important as well.
What when they're constructing this in their collaborative groups, what are the kind of areas of that are most contested? Like, what do they kind of disagree on? Is there any element of real subjectivity to interpretation of where these are placed or how they're weighted? Precisely.
It's a good exercise for students that have come into the class unfamiliar with meter, trying to understand what meter is and whether Plath writes metrically. And of course, she doesn't. And without knowing her style, the debate is opening the book and having a look and saying, wow, what form does this text actually look like? And can we then call the sonnet something that's metrical? Or does that go under the group poetic genre or poetic form? And what do we call that? Is it form or genre?
Yep.
Makes for interesting debate. And of course, sound. You know, what do we call sonic imagery? Do we call it rhyme or do we call it sound? Are we dealing with phonetic intensives or are we dealing with...
So they're negotiating their common critical language, and that's essential, really, to comment meaningfully on the text.
Precisely. And here's a photo on the board of the students collaborating. They organized themselves in this particular class, and on the board you can see that they have the periodic table poetry projected, and underneath they are actually writing the definitions, so that the boys drawing the periodic table can make reference to the definitions. And there was a dialogue happening across the room, which is fantastic. And so other students who were working on the collaborative Google Doc were defining poetic terms and reconfirming the ones that they thought they had known by memory, by referring to the Abrams Dictionary or Glossary of Literary Terms, but also Stephen Adams' Poetic Designs, which I think does a good job breaking down the formal elements of poetry.
What's quite nice here then is that the technology is just serving as a tool for a bigger interaction. So the technology is, well, a technique in the original, Greek meaning of technos, for simply this sharing of information, but then the bigger collaboration is actually taking place in the room between the groups at the computer and the groups at the board. So.
Yeah, precisely. And I think it's important to have this hybrid approach. You have to use a physical space in front of you, the conversation in front of you, instead of burying yourself in your laptop.
Yep, I like that. That would possibly be a good jumping off point to also talk about how you manage to use digital learning environments for collaborative planning and sharing within the department. Do you want to talk through maybe another unit, because obviously you're currently only teaching the HL class and myself the HLSL, so there isn't a collaborative teaching team with the grade 12 literature course at the moment. I think elsewhere in the language and literature course you are in a collaborative team. Do you want to talk through one of the units there?
Yeah, I'll share with you our grade 10 unit this year, which is poetry.
Okay, cool.
Right.
Yeah.
We decided to start with poetry and look specifically at formal elements of verse and meter.
Okay.
Because the question being, how do students describe the effect of poetry? And how much history do we need to know in order to describe it usefully?
I mean, it's not entirely coincidental, this, isn't it? It's definitely revealing of your bias, which is great within a big team, because it's one of a number of biases that the students get exposed to because we collaborate in these units.
Yes, and I think, again, from the formalist point of view, making sure that all the teachers are aware that, again, the task for IB is being able to give the students the tool belt, the vernacular in order to describe what is happening in a text that shapes meaning. It should be our first priority, I hope. And then to layer on the critical discourse on top of that will really take the grade 11 and 12 year to a whole new level. So if we scaffold it really well in MYP, we're going to be in good shape in DP. And that cross curricular conversation can begin to happen for interdisciplinary units as well. We have our poetry unit outlined. So as a staff, as a department, we've decided on key concepts, related concepts, global context, and a statement of inquiry. So this is MYP terminology, which I think works actually rather well for DP. So if you're familiar with it, there's no reason why you can't use it. And we agree on a number of questions. Our unit question is, what is prosody? Our conceptual question is ideas regarding meter of change over time. What does this mean for readers of poetry? And the debatable question is, poetry clearly written with form has a greater effect on the reader. And
I think probably the simplest way to think of extrapolating from these terms in NYP to DP is, a lot of the time we're looking at the TOK dimension. The core is perhaps more embedded within the NYP interdisciplinary type approach to the teaching of language and literature, where the core of TOK provides this dimension in the teaching of the diploma course.
Precisely. As a team, we agreed on some initial planning. And of course, I think being flexible as teachers is the most significant strength that we have, because your class will surprise you. Maybe they'll be ahead of the game, maybe they'll be behind a little bit, but if you have a general idea of where you're headed with your classes as a whole department, then I think you're in good shape, you'll be laughing. And so we scaffolded a number of lessons together, and so that takes place over the course of the first week before we got started. And usually the week or two before the second unit, we'll meet and do the same thing. So we cover about 14 classes. We always make sure that there's a creative product, and we always make sure that there is either a written or oral component to the task.
So is this lesson by lesson mapped out?
This is more or less lesson by lesson, and with resources that we have available to us.
Now, what about these comments that I see appearing here and there on the side?
Right. Well, my personal take on using this is to shape a class with a quotation, thematic entry point. And when we use that quotation, if we use that quotation, it's up to, of course, the individual teacher. But it gives me a way into a discussion with the students.
A kind of conceptual core to the lesson, right?
Yeah, precisely. And I also like to make it clear that class by class we are discussing specific literary terms. Okay, so again, the formalist in me is wanting to make sure that the students are aware of the tools that they have.
Sure.
But we also talk about the language elements. So that might include assessment information. So when we talk about, for example, a statement, writing a statement, or we're talking about context. What does this mean? In this way, the student can go back and look at class number 3 and say, we discussed context at class, where are my notes here?
Right. Yep.
Defining sentiment versus sentimental, where are my notes here? And it's actually, I think, a very good complement to their study notes when it comes to an assessment at the end of the year.
And what about, I noticed there was a comment on the side, if you scroll down a page?
Scroll down a page. So this is for my this is for my peers, and of course I added a quotation from Eminem. Damn, how much damage can you do with a pen? And I think that's a great line. And Eminem, of course, is just a fantastic writer, in my opinion. But
so this is part of the way in which it's a collaborative planning resource with the teachers, as well as it's something that you can use in the classroom, and there can be this kind of discourse amongst teachers as the document evolves and takes shape. Exactly.
Students have this capability as well, and when they become more confident or comfortable with the common function on a Google Doc, they can start to ask you questions or points of clarification. If you write something wrong, they'll call you on it, and I encourage them to, which is fantastic. What I shared with this year in the grade 10 class, for example, is all the classes that we've planned, but I made it clear that they may not exactly match what we do.
Sure. So it's a kind of working document.
Exactly.